Morning, everybody. My name's Captain Chris. I'm one of the captains and educators here as part of the education team at Save the Bay. Really excited to be with you this morning at 10 o'clock for our very first Facebook live stream as part of our series we're having called Breakfast by the Bay. It's going to be something that we're trying to do every day at 10 o'clock to help those of us that maybe still trying to learn but aren't in a classroom right now. So we'll be offering up different lessons about things about Narragansett Bay or the plants and animals that call the bay home or the habitats around the bay in order to kind of keep you involved with what we're doing here at Save the Bay. So we're really excited to be offering it to you. You'll be able to tune in live every day at 10. And then once we're done with all of these live streams, they will be posted back up that you'll be able to interact with. Some days our lessons will include crafts at the end that you'll be able to do at home or some downloadable materials so that you can revisit the lesson and work along with us at that time. So I'm gonna kind of just work really slowly here in the beginning, and hopefully a lot of our friends are joining as we go. I'm getting the nod that we've got a lot of people watching, which is great. So I'll get started. I'll make sure to reintroduce us and what we're doing as we move along. So I wanted to start with something that is kind of a personal topic for me. I don't know about you guys, but anytime I visit any of the beaches here in Rhode Island or anywhere I go on my travels, I can't help just staring at the ground all the time and looking for souvenirs, usually things like shells that look really pretty or pique my interest to me. And it always makes me think of when we're here at Save the Bay teaching our students, a lot of times we get questions about what is that shell or who made that shell? And what's even more wild for me is a lot of times people don't even know that a shell was once home to an animal. They think a shell is a lot like a rock in that it just kind of was made by the earth, and that's not the case at all. The shells that we're finding used to be home for a lot of animals that call Narragansett Bay home. So I wanted to talk to you about those animals that call those shells home. If you guys have any questions or comments as we're going, feel free to just type them out, shoot them our way. I've got Captain Megan on the back side of our camera here, and she's gonna shout any of those at me. Hopefully I know the answers. A lot of times I do, but often I don't. So we'll always just encourage you to look something up afterwards, and maybe if you find the answer, you leave it on there in the comment section as well. So the animals that I'm talking about that make these shells are called mollusks. A lot of times people refer to these as shellfish, right? So these are animals that often make a shell and have that as their home. Now, this is not as much of the fun part as when we're gonna visit some of the shells later, but I wanted everybody to know what makes a mollusk a mollusk. And there's four things really. One is called having something that's called a visceral mass. And that's really just a place where you find all the organs inside of the animal. So it's something that you'd be eating if you're like me and like to eat some of these mollusks like clams and mussels. It's a lot of where you find things like the stomach, the gills, and things like that. Another thing that they have is something called a specialized foot, which in some of these mollusks has been turned into tentacles over time. And that foot, or those tentacles, are used for moving around the bay, whether that's swimming through the water or digging down into the mud and dirt and sand. Along with that, inside they have what's called a mantle, which is a lot of muscle. And if you're eating something like a squid, you've eaten the mantle, which are those round rings that we like to enjoy when we're eating calamari. And then the last part that a lot of times people think of as that real defining characteristic of a mollusk is having a shell. But that's not always the case. And we're gonna see when that isn't the case, some of those exceptions to the rule. So we're gonna move aboard for a second, and I'll make sure to reintroduce myself and kind of what we're doing again. Oh. So, again, my name's Chris, here from Save the Bay, going over our first Facebook Live Breakfast by the Bay lesson, learning a little bit about mollusks this morning, so you can learn about who they are, what they are, and then when we get outside, when we're able to walk on the beach and things like that, you'll be able to identify them. So all of our mollusks get broken down into three categories. And those categories, different groups of animals have these fancy scientific names, but if you know what they mean, then it makes a lot of sense. So the first group of our mollusks are something called bivalves. So bivalve is just a fancy word for having two shells. So bi means two, and valve is referring to their shells. So these are any of the animals that have two shells. That we lost our lights there. Maybe if I move around a little more, we'll kick them back on. We'll see if Captain Megan can help me out. There we go. Thank you, Captain Megan. That's perfect. We might have to do that 1 or 2 more times depending on how long I talk. So our bivalves are animals with 2 shells that are stuck together at a hinge, and they can open and close those if they want. So some examples that we have here in Narragansett Bay and all along the south coast are things like oysters, which have 2 shells stuck together at that hinge. Really good for eating, and I know that there's a lot of oystermen all around Narragansett Bay that are growing these here in Rhode Island for all of us to eat. A lot of times the oysters out in the Pacific you can find have a pearl growing inside. So that's who would give us pearls, are the oysters. This right here is a picture of some mussels, the blue mussel specifically. That's the species that you would be eating if you're having mussels when you're out at a restaurant. Also, clams, like some of our soft shell and hard shell clams we have around in Narragansett Bay. And then one of my personal favorites are the scallops. A really cool image of the scallop right here. If Captain Megan gets a little close for just a moment, you can see that all along the edge of that scallop are these little spots, these little black and blue spots, and those are actually scallop eyes. So our scallops, clams, mussels, and oysters, those are all our bivalves, or animals with 2 shells, mollusks with 2 shells. Another group of mollusks that you might be pretty familiar with are the gastropods. And again, fancy word, but if you know what it means, it'll make a lot of sense. Gastro is referring to a stomach. Pod, like a tripod, is something with 3 feet. So pod means foot. So gastropod are animals that have their stomachs attached to their feet. Sounds kind of silly, and you probably can't picture the animal in your head without having these in front of you. So the gastropods are also sometimes called univalves because just like the bivalves, they have a shell, but they've got one, a lot of them do. So those are animals like on land, we have our freshwater snails that you see sliding around maybe in your garden, or when you go exploring in the woods by a pond, you can find freshwater snails. We have a lot of snails in Narragansett Bay too. The one up top here is a moon snail. So moon snails and our freshwater snails are 2 examples of these gastropods with shells. There are a couple kinds of gastropods without shells too, and they can look really silly, but if you picture a shell on top of them, it makes a lot of sense that they're in this group. This guy right here we all recognize from your garden also. You want to try and keep it off your plants so it's not eating them. That is our slug. So a slug is just a lot like this land snail, but without a shell on top of it. And then one of my absolute favorite marine animals is a group of animals called the nudibranch. Nudibranchs are kind of like sea slugs, slugs underwater in the marine environment. Now, we don't have nudibranchs around here that look this pretty in Narragansett Bay, but if you go to a lot of coral reefs and places like that, you find beautifully colored nudibranchs, these kind of sea slugs. These gastropods, but without a shell. So they're one of the exceptions to the rule. And then the last group that we often forget about are cephalopods. Cephalopod, we have our pod still, so that means foot. Cephalo means head. So these are animals that have their heads attached to their feet. And again, sounds silly, but when you take a look at the pictures, it'll make sense. So one big group of cephalopods are the octopus that we would find a lot of times a little more offshore in the Atlantic, not really in Narragansett Bay, but out in the Pacific as well. One that we do have a lot of here in Narragansett Bay and off our coast that Rhode Island's really famous for are the squid. Really delicious. If you've eaten them as calamari, you've hung out with a squid before. And those have a head attached to their feet. And then they've got a close relative called a cuttlefish that sounds really cute, but they look a lot like a squid. And then the last one I wanted to show you that we don't really have in Narragansett Bay is something called a nautilus, a chambered nautilus. And that's kind of like if you put a squid inside of a snail shell, and they swim all around the ocean. So these are our 3 groups of mollusks. Again, if you're just tuning in right now during the live stream, I'm Chris. I'm from the education team here at Save the Bay, part of our Breakfast by the Bay series that we're going to be offering every morning, 10 o'clock, coming to you either from here at the Bay Center or down at our Exploration Center and Aquarium in Newport, giving you all kinds of lessons for when our learners are hanging out at home instead of in a traditional classroom. We're learning about mollusks today and all the different diversity of mollusks. If you have any questions about who these are, what they are, where to find them, feel free to just type away in there. Hopefully Captain Megan or I know the answer. Not always, but that's why we always encourage you to look it up yourselves as well if we don't know. I love learning things. So these are all of our mollusks, our cephalopods, our gastropods, and our bivalves. We brought along one of our favorite bivalve friends to show you a little bit about what these can look like. A little bigger. All right, so I'm gonna pull him out for just a moment as I disappear. Oh, now I'm back. This is Clammy. So Clammy is a really big version of one of our hard-shell clams, or quahogs we call them, in Rhode Island and in New England here. This is kind of our official state shellfish, this quahog. So Clammy is a lot bigger than we would ever find a quahog in Narragansett Bay, but if you're out clamming or digging for them, this is the animal that we'd be looking for. So again, Clammy is one of our bivalves. Clammy's knocking around some of my shells on the table here. So it's got two shells that stick together at the hinge, and they can open and close. Now, these mollusks and bivalves don't like to open their shell too often, because if you have any idea what it's used for, you can probably take a pretty good guess. They're nice and hard. It's for protection. So if they open, they're gonna get eaten. So they only like to open for a couple of reasons. And one would be to open a little bit and take water inside their body, because in a moment we'll see that their gills are on the inside, and they need water going in to breathe. They also need to bring water in to eat. These shellfish like to filter the water for little plants and animals called plankton, and that's what they eat a lot of. So a clam, like Clammy, but a regular size, about this size, is capable of filtering about 40 or 50 gallons of water a day. So they are really, really good at passing water through them to get all of that plankton to eat. The only other reason a clam or an oyster or a scallop is going to want to open its shell is to move, believe it or not. So scallops can open and close their shell and flap along and move above the sand and mud through the water. Clams, like Clammy, would use this right here, the foot that I was talking about before, that sticks out of their shell, and they use it like a shovel, and they'll dig in the bottom and then bury themselves sideways down in. So Captain Megan's going to get close for a second here, and I will open up Clammy for just a moment to show you some of what's going on the inside. So we don't have a lot. Our normal clams, real clams, would have a lot more going on. So if you were eating this as like a whole belly clam, you might be a little disappointed. But this is Clammy's foot that I was talking about. So Clammy uses that to dig down into the sand and sediment where it was going to live below the surface. I was also talking about before, these are some of Clammy's gills that Clammy will be using to get oxygen out of the water in order to breathe. And then higher up into the shell is where you would find some of those defining characteristics that I was talking about before, which are Clammy's mantle and Clammy's visceral mass, where this is where all the organs would be, things like the stomach, the kidneys, and I was talking about the gills and things like that. So this is kind of what the inside of a clam would look like. If you notice also, while I've got Clammy open, this beautiful purple all throughout our hard-shell clam, or quahog. That's one of the ways when we're combing the beaches and we find shells to know that we've got this hard-shell clam or the quahog is this beautiful purple shell. Quahogs have a really long, proud history in Rhode Island and in New England, because the native people like the Narragansett and other local tribes would use the purple parts of the inside of the quahog to make beads out of and put on necklaces, and they'd be called wampum, and that was something that was very special in their communities. So that is Clammy, our hard-shell clam. I'm going to put Clammy away for a second. He likes to hide. He's a little shy sometimes. Oh. So again, if you guys have any questions about anything that we're doing, Captain Megan says we might have something.
We have one question.
Yeah, go for it.
How long can clams survive out of the water?
Oh, that's a really good question. So clams and shellfish, I actually don't speak clam, so I'm not entirely sure. But I know that if you go to like a seafood market and you were to get oysters, say, and put them in the refrigerator, which is probably the most common experience that a lot of us have with keeping shellfish out of water, they'll be fine for over a week in your refrigerator. As long as they're nice and cold, a lot of these things, like the clams, can keep water inside their shell. And when they open up, they actually suck in air, and it mixes with that water and adds a lot more oxygen to the water. So the worst thing you could do is keep a clam or an oyster in the water and not be adding air into it. They'll die really quickly. But I've kept oysters in my refrigerator for 2 weeks, and they were still alive afterwards, and still pretty tasty as well. So I'm sure every shellfish, every clam or scallop species is a little bit different, but I bet they'd be fine for quite a while. I wouldn't encourage you to go and grab a whole bunch of clams and oysters from the beach and keep them out of the water for a long time. You want to put them back, but if you were going to eat them, they could probably stay out for a while. So again, I'm Captain Chris here with Breakfast by the Bay that we're going to be doing every morning, 10 o'clock. I'm here at our Bay Center in Providence today. Tomorrow you'll be joining us if you tune in down at the Exploration Center and Aquarium in Newport. We'll have lots of staff offering you lots of educational opportunities throughout these coming weeks when we're learning from home instead of in the classroom. So we're talking mollusks today. We've talked a lot about diversity. Captain Megan and I wanted to show you some of the shells that you might find. So if you get out onto a beach, if you're trying to shake a little cabin fever, or just the next time you're out, maybe during the summertime, and you're near that beach here in Narragansett Bay, or at home if you're not in Rhode Island, some of the animals that you might find, right? Because remember, these shells were once home to a lot of the animals. So they didn't just spring out of nowhere. Animals made these. So I have some examples of some bivalves that we wanted to show you. One that you probably wouldn't find if you're on a beach in Narragansett Bay, but you would definitely find down on the south coast are something called a surf clam. These surf clams get really big. They're a little more oval in shape, but they're a really big clam. A lot of times if you're eating something like a clam strip, this is what you would be eating, this Atlantic surf clam. Another clam that I was talking about already are these right here. Pardon all of our markers on the table. It's one of our craft tablecloths we use a lot. So these are shells of the quahog, or the hard shell clam. So again, it's got that purple inside, so we know we're working with that hard shell clam. They do get a lot bigger than the one that you see here. And a lot of times we'll find them different sizes if we find them at the market. And we call them things like little necks or cherry stones, chowder clams, all depending on the size of them. So these are the hard shell clam or the quahog. I'm going to grab another shell. Captain Megan said we've got another question we wanted to try and address.
Yeah, we have a couple questions.
Oh goodness, don't overwhelm me.
What animals would like to eat clams?
Oh, really good question. So a lot of animals are going to want to eat clams in Narragansett Bay and all around the world. If you're not going underwater, the first thing you might think of that loves to eat a clam is something like a seagull. So seagulls will fly around all the shallow water, especially at low tide, when some of these soft shell or hard shell clams are exposed. And they'll come down and grab them with their beak, and they'll fly up high over a parking lot and drop them down into the parking lots of rows. And it shatters that hard shell open so they can eat that inside visceral mass in the mantle. In the water, there's a couple different kinds of animals that like to eat these. Sea stars love eating bivalves, clams and mussels and oysters. And they wrap these up and are able to open the shell up and pull out all of those organs and the visceral mass inside. Other snails eat clams as well. So those are just some of the examples of things that are eating some of our clams and shellfish.
We got a couple other questions,
Yeah.
Captain Chris. When you're out on the bay, what's the most common shellfish that you catch?
Oh goodness, so when we're out on the bay and I'm out on our boat and we're trawling with our net, often one of the things we catch a lot of are the snails that live above the bottom, something like a whelk shell right here. So we have these big whelk, or sometimes people around here call them conch, and they're on the surface of the bottom. So when our net goes across, we catch them in our net very often. Others, if you're going to be in the rocky shore, things like the periwinkles, which are very small snails all around the rocky coast, and lots of little snails called a slipper snail, which we'll take a closer look at in a moment.
One more question.
Yeah.
It's from one of our 5-year-old viewers.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Wow.
how long does an octopus live for?
Oh, that is a really good question, and I wish I knew the answer. So Captain Chris's degree is in vertebrate biology, and that's things with the backbones. So I never got into lifespans of octopus. And we don't have a lot of them over here in the Atlantic. So I would not even want to take a guess because I might steer you wrong. But the first thing that I'm doing when I get done here with this live stream is I'm going to check it out online. And if it's a comment that you left right there, we'll make sure to reply to you with an average lifespan of some of these. Because I think things like the giant Pacific octopus can live for a really long time. Cool. So I want to show you a couple more of our bivalves that we might find on the beach. So things like are scallops. So there are two kinds of scallop shells you might find. This big one over here on your left is a sea scallop. So when you're eating scallops and you're eating the big one, it's usually the sea scallop. And this little one right here is something called a bay scallop. So they are two different species, but they live very similarly. And this shell that you're seeing of this scallop right here, this guy's probably about 2 or 3 years old. And that's about as old as they need to be in order for people that are going out to catch scallops to eat. So if you find any of these on the beach, those are the scallops. Oysters are another really common one that we'll find all around Narragansett Bay. Oysters are pretty cool because when they're little babies, they stick to a rock or stick to a shell, and they don't move anywhere during their lifetime. So they stay put. One that I love finding all over, sometimes people call these mermaids' toenails. I used to call them grandpa's toenails. And these are something called a jingle shell. They're really pretty colors, yellow, orange, sometimes a little silver or black. And this is a type of bivalve also, so I have 2 shells that stick together. And then the last really common one that I wanted to show you that we find all around Narragansett Bay are the mussels. This one here is a blue mussel. That's that species you would be eating if you're at a restaurant. And then this one over here is called the ribbed mussel. So if you're exploring near a beach, you might find the blue mussel. If you're exploring near a marsh, you might find some of those ribbed mussels.
We have a few more questions that came in, Captain
Absolutely.
Chris. Are there any invasive mollusks that we should be on the lookout for?
Oh my gosh. Well, if you go way, way back, something like a periwinkle that we find all over Narragansett Bay now was originally an invasive. That was a species that was brought over from Europe in the 1800s on the bottom of ships and was accidentally introduced. And it's been around for so long that a lot of people consider it kind of a native right now, even though it didn't used to be here about 300 or 400 years ago. Off the top of my head, I can't think of a lot of other invasive mollusks, lots of other invasive crustaceans and things like that. But right after I get to that age of an octopus question, we're going to be looking at some of our invasive species, our invasive mollusks that we might find. And we'll make sure to reply to it once our live stream's over. So thank you for the question. A couple quick snails. Again, I already told you, so we've seen it. These are our whelk, or sometimes called a conch around here in New England. Although they're truly a whelk, there's 2 species. This one's called the channeled whelk because of this really deep channeled groove that you might find along the top, this circular pattern right there. So that's the channeled whelk. It's just a big old snail that made that shell. And then this little one is called a knobbed whelk. It's called a knobbed whelk because of these knobby bumps. Whoops, I'm going to drop it right off the table that we find over there. So these are some of the carnivorous snails that are going to be eating other mollusks, along with something like this. This one right here is called a moon snail. And the moon snail is like the whelk, a big carnivorous snail that is sliding around on the bottom. So these guys are actively hunting. And then one we find all over the beaches that I mentioned before is something called a slipper snail. So slipper snails are called that because when you look at the shell that's left behind, it looks like if you were a tiny little person, you could slide your foot right into there and wear them like a little slipper. Something else you might find when you're exploring around is this right here I wanted to show everybody. These are whelk egg cases. So if you find any of these are egg cases that were left behind by the mom whelk when they lay them in the water, and a lot of times they'll dry up like that. So lots of cool things we can find when we're exploring around the beaches in Narragansett Bay.
One of our 7-year-old viewers has a question for you, Captain Chris.
Yeah, what do we got?
How many clams are there in the bay?
Oh my gosh, how many clams? Species, we've probably got close to a dozen. Well, that might be an overstatement, but there's a lot. How many individuals? I wouldn't even begin to guess. We have a really great clam fishing industry that's supported here in Narragansett Bay with a lot of people that are catching us seafood every day. And when they go out, they're catching clams all the time. So I wouldn't even be able to begin to put a number on how many clams there are, but it's a lot. And what's really cool is we just found out that right outside our windows here at our Save the Bay Center in Providence, that it might be one of the very important places for clams to be having their babies that then make their way down into Narragansett Bay. Awesome. So that's all I've got for you to show you about our clams and about all of our bivalves and gastropods and cephalopods. The last thing that I wanted to show you is a way that you could make your own clam or your own scallop or own mussel at home. I know a lot of us are looking for things to do around the house, and there's a real easy way to make one. Now that you know what they are and what they look like, we can make one at home with some materials that you might have on your own. So Captain Megan and I got a little busy this morning with some of our arts and crafts that we're really excited to show you about, and we made some scallops and oysters. So all you need is a little paper plate. If you have one really big paper plate, or maybe even a couple tiny ones, you can make your own clam or make your own scallop or oyster. And all Captain Megan and I did were color in the tops of our shells. And I made a scallop and I put all of the eyes right along the edge of the shell. I got a little silly and put a little tongue inside as well. You can also, if you've got some googly eyes laying around, put some right on top and add some tissue paper inside. So all it takes are a couple paper plates that we colored in ahead of time, a little bit of tissue paper if you got some. It doesn't even have to be tissue paper. You could use just a bunch of newspaper at home and pretend that it looks all pink like that. Close your clamshell up, a piece of tape right in the middle, and you have got your own bivalve. Sometimes these clams like to hang out on the bottom, or scallops like to hang out on the bottom and grow seaweed all over them. So if you want to decorate the top and make it look really pretty or silly like it's got seaweed growing all over it, it is really easy to find some little bits that you can glue right on the top. Awesome. So we're going to hang out for just another minute or so because we might have some extra questions. And again, you'll be able to access this video if you're not watching right now. Then I don't know why I'm even talking to you. But you're going to be watching it when we post it later on our Facebook page. So you can go through the whole thing, watch it again, and relearn everything about all of our mollusks. Questions, Meg?
Yeah, we have another one from our 5-year-old viewer.
Awesome. Hello.
Which mollusks do people fish for?
Ooh, which mollusks do people fish for? So the most common ones that people are going to be trying to gather in Narragansett Bay are the hard-shell clam, the quahog, and that's going to be your stuffies when they're really big, making your clam chowder, all the way down to your little necks and cherry stones. A lot of times people love to eat the soft-shell clam, which I didn't mention before, that lives down in the sand and sediment as well. So scallops and mussels, scallops and blue mussels are two that people love to eat as well. We don't have these big sea scallops in Narragansett Bay, but we will get some of the little bay scallops. And then for snails, it's tough to find, but you can eat the whelk. They're pretty tasty, and I've actually, Captain Chris gets a little wild. I've eaten some slipper snails before, and they're not too bad. You just have to go and get a lot of them because they're really tiny. Any other questions for us, Captain Meg?
Do octopus and squid have a shell at all?
Oh, really, really good question. Yeah, so I mentioned that some of our mollusks don't have a shell at all. Some don't look like they have a shell, but theirs is just hiding. So things like the slugs and the nudibranch and the octopus, they've lost their shell. But squids still have a shell. It's just located inside of their body, and it's become really, really thin. It's something that a lot of people refer to as a pen. So you can go to the grocery store even and do a squid dissection, but don't do it yet, because I think we're going to be doing one in just a couple days or maybe next week, and we'll walk you through how to do a dissection. When you go inside, you can find the pen, which is a shell. It used to be on the outside like on our nautilus, but is now inside that squid. So stay tuned for that one, because I think it's something we've got coming down the road.
Do you have a favorite shellfish, Chris?
Do I have a favorite shellfish? Oh my goodness. My favorite, if I can count all the mollusks, even one without the shells, are the squid. These squid are absolutely amazing. They're really cool. They can change colors out here in Narragansett Bay or out in the ocean. And if you're eating calamari almost anywhere in the world, it's almost certainly was caught here in Rhode Island. We land a lot of squid down in Point Judith, Galilee. So it's a really important species for our state. So it's not just all about the quahog. We've got our squids that we owe a lot to as well.
Any suggestions of places that we can go out and look for these shells?
Oh man, if you want to go outside, remember you want to be really careful when you're doing it and be out in small groups right now. But down the line, my favorite, where I found a lot of moon snails, which are one of my favorite shells to find around, is down at Easton's Beach or any of the small beaches that are around in Newport. I live up here in Providence, so I have to go a little further away to get down to some of the beaches in the lower bay. But I love poking around any of the beaches in South County. And always you're going to find a lot of the good stuff in what we call the rack line, which is where the waves wash up lots of seaweed and shells. So if you're walking along the beach and you find a line of seaweed, poke around in there a little bit and you'll probably find some really good shells. Awesome. Well, I'm glad you guys had so many questions for me. And like I said, we're going to make sure to follow up with answers to questions that we couldn't answer during our live streams, because we don't all know everything, although sometimes we like to think we do. So we'll make sure to follow up with you with all of those answers later on. And again, keep tuning in every day, 10 o'clock, for our Breakfast by the Bay, where all of us educators are going to be offering a lot of educational opportunities for you while you're continuing to learn at home. I had a lot of fun with you guys and look forward to interacting with you more on Facebook as the weeks continue. Take care.